So we expect. So there's going to be jokes, some maybe some social satire, some irony, a little gap between expectation and reality. Uh, okay. What else? Anything?
You laugh at the pain and misfortune of the characters?
Yes, we can. That's I think a feature of satire, which a lot of comic theorists think is a subset of comedy, or you get someone like Simon Critchley who thinks it's actually the opposite of comedy, but he's wrong. Yeah.
The characters themselves are very over the top. They're kind of caricatures.
Right.
Physical humor?
Yeah.
In the one sense, marriage.
Yeah. Happy ending, right? Is that important for a comedy? Can you think of any comedies that don't have happy endings? Anyone seen Dr. Strangelove?
Yes.
But it's for them it's a happy ending, right? And it's actually more, we'll see, it's in the tradition of old comedy. Does this show up at all? No. It's because if you haven't seen, will somebody hip us to what happens if, whoa, that didn't work.
Use those buttons on that
switches are
panel.
down.
Ah, that's why you guys make the big bucks. So how does Dr. Strangelove end?
Is that the one where all the Greeks go up?
Yeah.
Yep.
But what happens to the people that were attached to it in the movie? There we go. All right, I'll tell you. So I'll give you the spiel of Strangelove. So in Dr. Strangelove, it's I think it might be the best comedy ever. This crazy guy, Jack T. Ripper, sends a code out for the planes to bomb the then Soviet Union, and it's a preemptive strike because he's convinced that the commies have through the fluoride and the water supply they're doing mind control, and it's a great movie. We should just forget about Shakespeare and watch this. But anywho, then they find out and they try to stop it, and the point of the movie is they're trying to stop it, and they do, but there's a malfunction which works, and you'll see in the comedy. And one plane gets through, and he heroically, gets through all the defenses because he doesn't have the radio or anything, so he thinks he's an all-American hero. And in an interesting twist, the actor who played it thought that that was his role. He didn't know it was a comedy until he saw it. But then it sets off the doomsday device. And this is hilarious too. But the doomsday device is just going to blow up the whole world, right? And so they're screwed. They can't do anything, right? But they're like, well, we've got enough time that we can dig tunnels and we can go down into the mine shafts. And then the title character, one of Peter Sellers, he plays like 5 people in it, but he's this ex-Nazi with alien hand syndrome, and he's always wrestling his hand. And it's a real thing. I looked it up. So he suggests this, and so they all go and they get 10 women each for reproductive purposes. So they get to go down and wait 100 years in the mine shafts with the artificial life and 10 women each. And so it's even though the world ends, it's still like a total comedy, and like a real old comedy. But yeah, can anybody think of a comedy without a happy ending? I can think of funny tragedies. I mean, there's like Othello's not a happy ending, but it's built like a comedy. But all right, well, anyway, a brief history of comedy. My PowerPoint. Does anyone know Greek? Ancient Greek, that is. Everybody used to have to learn it in college. I don't know it at all. I just looked this up. Komoedia. It's from komos, which means revel. What does revel mean?
Party?
Yeah. And ode, I guess, which is ode, which is song. So the idea is the Greek comedy started off as it just kind of turned into an organized party. It just used to be you would have this ceremony, everybody would dance and sing, and song, and it got more structured as we went along, and finally in 487 or 6 BC or BCE, depending on how you want to look at it. You know the difference between BC and BCE? I prefer BC. Is anyone offended if I just go BC? Okay. That's just, it was when I was a kid, that's what we learned. And you always, when you get old, you always decide that what you learned is better than what they teach you now. It's the law. And then so that's the first official Greek comedy. Comedies or humor, some form of comedies, and some form of even performances actually turns out to be one of those rare human universals that all cultures have a version of one way or the other. All known cultures. There's probably some cultures that didn't make it, that didn't. It might be why. Tragedy is not the case. Tragedies, there's only 2 or 3 known cultures that have produced tragedies. But comedies, the content of comedies is wildly divergent, but everybody's got comedies. A little incongruous. So in Greece, you had the party where comedy was born was called Dionysia, and the patron god of Dionysia was Dionysus. Anyone know who Dionysus is? Yeah, he's the god of wine, as you can tell. And I really like these different ones. Like, this is one of the most obscene paintings I've ever seen in my life. That's number 2. And that's just freaking awesome. So you see he's portrayed in a number of different ways. The legend of Dionysia, how it started in Athens, and Athens is the place where comedy as we know it started, was the, let me see if I can pronounce this right, the Eleutherians, who were other Greeks, brought a gift statue of Dionysus to Athens, and then but Athens they were Athena guys, right? So they didn't want him. So they're like, nah. And then but what happened was not all, but a good deal of the men in Athens came down with a disease that affected their genitals, shut them down. So they had to appease the angry god, and they brought the statue of Dionysus, and who would preside over Dionysia thereafter. And you see why. It's funny. But so Dionysus has 2 sort of profound faces, because he was, on the one hand, he's one of the oldest chronologically appearing of the intact Greek god world. What is it, Pan something? Anyway, along with Demeter, who was the goddess of grains, but he was just so he's an old world like earth god, but he kind of gets recast, and so he's got these 2 distinct faces. So on the one hand, he's like Demeter, and he's a serious, just like bringer of grapes, and wine was a nutrient, for them, like beer in England. I think still is. They consider it a meal. And if you drink something like a Guinness, you could drink 4 Guinnesses and be full. I mean, I couldn't, but so. But anyway, so they have 2 versions of Dionysia, and one was celebrated in the winter. It's called rural Dionysia, and this is for your bearer of grapes. And there's a lot of loaves, procession. It takes place in the country, and pretty respectable. There's a little bit of drinking, but it's more of a solemn, kind of a serious religious rite. But then there's what they call city Dionysia, and this is the other face. This is Bacchus. That's this character. I love Futurama. Have any of you seen the Futurama where Bender turns into a human? And then he just eats and just constantly eats and has sex and goes to the bathroom at the same time, and then just ends up dying of a coronary in like a week and a half. But he looks a lot like this. But the thing is just total indulgence, and a lot of cultures have versions of Carnival, Saturnalia. It's the original, a similar ritual. That or a similar ritual, depending on who you ask, is like the 12 days of Christmas and stuff. So it's we'll talk a little bit more about that. But anyway, so there's this other Dionysus and Dionysia, and the author calls it whining, dining, and concubining. And aside from the statue of the deity, the big symbol during City Dionysia was everywhere. Everybody wore them. They wore noses shaped like it. They wore straps shaped like it. They had big giant ones that they would run around with. Guess. The phallus. That was the official symbol of City Dionysia. So you get this lovely little situation where the law suspends all business. You can't, against the law, to enforce the law. So I mean, it usually didn't happen, but technically you could like murder somebody and nobody could do anything. A lot of drinking, a lot of what spring break strives for, like what everybody wants spring break to be, but it never quite turns out that way. You get this, we'll talk more about this when we get to Falstaff, but a misrule ceremony, they've got like fake kings, fake senators that are, passing anti-laws, and just, anything goes. I really wanted to say that anything that happens at Dionysia stays in Dionysia, but I thought that would be in bad. I mean, it's just stupid, right? So I didn't write it down, but I did say it, which is kind of the same thing in reverse, really. But yeah, so that. So sounds fun, right? So and then there's the phallic ritual was part of it. I mentioned that. Let's see if this thing works. Yeah. So so the theater fraternities, and they were actually fraternities, and their names were the Straight Rods and the Phallus Bearers, were my two favorite all-time fraternity names. And like this Omega Chi nonsense, be the Straight Rods, man. So they would get in masks and then just with these giant things. Saying this is translated, but this is a great translation. Get it up, make a great wide space for hail and hearty holy him, whose rod may overflow the brim. Nothing. And then the other element you were mentioning, we talked about meanness and satire. This was a big part of the Dionysia celebration too, because you could get the senators and put them up there and scream at them and yell at them and spit on their wives, and nobody could do anything. And this is just a little fun fact. You're familiar with the two great Homeric epics, I'm sure, at least in theory, the Iliad and the Odyssey. So the Iliad is generally considered a tragedy, and the Odyssey is a comedy because the Iliad ends with people dying, and the Odyssey ends with a remarriage, coming home. But the central character Odysseus, and the Odyssey is from Odysseia, which means to willingly cause pain and to enjoy it. So this is a core of comedy. Yeah, one of the there's very, very few comic universals, but one of them is seeing a man get hit in the groin. Just whatever culture you're from, it's funny. It's universally funny. Ha ha. So we're going to talk about old comedy and new comedy. Old comedy was really it was until Aristophanes there was really no plots. It was just sort of trying to structure these phallic rituals and these invective rituals of so you'd kind of somebody just sort of suggesting who to yell at and who to scream at and who to like stand-up comedy with no rules, manners. So they'd wear masks and make fun of this was a Aristophanes would make fun of Socrates because they were contemporaries, and the emperor, the senators, everybody got made fun of. And the audience was right there. It was just the stage wasn't really a stage. It was just surrounded by people. At least a lot of this is sort of reconstructed speculation, but it's fun anyway. And the targets of the invective were women, especially wives, of course, misers, anybody that was, there was always an omnipresent contingent of people that are like, you can't do this, our morals, this is not what the gods had in mind when they said to worship us, and then so they would get made fun of. Fathers, authority figures, military leaders, intellectuals, and even the gods and the goddesses. It was a maxim was no one is above ridicule, not even the gods, nobody. So it's like making fun of the Virgin Mary and stuff, which is weird. All right, so Aristophanes, he's the we like to think that he was the best because he's the only one whose play survived, but he never won. He never won a contest. We like to think he was ahead of his time. He might have just sucked. And if you say Aristophonic in a paper, it means obscene. And he's most famous for his relationship with Plato and Socrates. He did a number of send-ups of Socrates in his plays. Apparently, they were on again, off again sort of friends. He's a character in Plato's famous Symposia, and he has the most famous Platonic, or maybe the second most famous Platonic concept is actually his concept as a character. Does anyone know what it is? The idea of the whole beings getting ripped in half and then having to come back together, and that's what love is. You know that? Yeah. That was Aristophanes. Well, as a character. And so everybody says that was Plato, but Plato kind of hated him, and that he said that probably. And anywho, I'm sure that'll come up again. I can never get through a whole semester without bringing that up in class. It's not a great picture of him. He was most famous for being prematurely bald, and he's got a nice full head of hair there. All right. So, but he started giving a structure to it, and he started getting something like plots in Aristophanes, and the typical hero is an impotent old man who gets fired up about some damn fool idea. I really like writing damn fool on a PowerPoint, and like overthrowing the guy. So it's just this old guy, and he's always impotent, and everybody's making fun of him, and it's really, really obscene. So it's homosexuality was widely practiced in Athens at the time, but it still wasn't cool to be the bottom, and so that was get a lot of insults in that direction. Typical plot: the old man's damn fool idea turns society upside down. The antagonist is usually the son, so we're getting an opposite of Fry's paradigm here. The crazy old man almost always wins, and he winds up with a girl or three at the close, more often three. And so he goes off, and then so he would signal his potency. You wouldn't have to do psychological guess because he'd be sporting a flaccid phallus while he was impotent, and then at the end he would have the giant one going off with the girls who weren't girls, because even then they didn't allow actresses. It was just guys in padding, and so it would have been really interesting to see. And then, as a new comedy, the heroines are, they're like reconciliation or earnestness or peace. He was sort of a pacifist, famously hated the king of Athens at the time, and may have got old comedy banned. I'm not really sure. And then the heroines were also superhuman pipe girls. We know what pipe girls did in Athens. They did two things. they went to the big banquets, and while everyone was eating, they would play pipes, and when we were done eating, they would go around and service all the men under the tables while they were enjoying the dessert. It wasn't a great job. People want these plays to be about fertility and symbolic rebirth. That's kind of how they kept getting studied, throughout the Victorian era and stuff. But they're not. It's about they're Viagra plays, right? It's the male member, plain and simple, which in the course of the play goes from flaccid to rigid. An impotent old man finds a magical little pill, and hilarity ensues. Sample plot: the birds, two old pederasts, decide to overthrow the gods. They Jack Hera from Zeus, still as Thunderbolt, take over the universe, and that's the play. And they're completely unreadable. I mean, there's just it's all aside from you giggle at all of the poop jokes, but like you don't know the references. It's not they're really funny in theory though. So old comedy died. It was sort of like once you overthrow the gods and stuff, like it's got really nowhere to go. While Aristophanes was writing, there was also this tragic tradition going on that kind of ended up in Euripides, who really wrote kind of soap opera melodramas, which were they may or may not be sad, but it was just sort of more of what we would expect from a soap opera. That's good. And so New Comedy actually borrows more from Euripides than that. Menander is they thought his plays were lost forever, but they found them. But he's referenced in antiquity as being the best, and they're not necessarily funny. They're so you think of romantic comedies, right? There might be some lighthearted humor in it. Fellas, have you ever seen a romantic comedy that wasn't funny? I have. They're not funny, but adopted by a Roman comedian. So it really, this is what took off, and Shakespeare's influence by the old comedy influence is really buried. Shakespeare probably was not directly familiar with Aristophanes because nobody would have translated it, and Shakespeare's Greek was iffy at best. But that's the comic plot that we know. It's the comic plot that Fry deals with almost exclusively in his little essay. So this is the Menandrian plot. And I'm just going to go ahead and read it because this is a great quote from a neat guy. I really like this guy. During one of the Athenian fertility festivals, so they were meta, so they would always take place during the festival that it was being performed at. Under cover of night, a well-bred young man, intoxicated by wine in the spirit of the Komos, forcefully seduces, that is, rapes, a well-bred young girl. In his haste to decamp, he neglects to notice that he has somehow lost his ring. Some time later, in the daylight, he falls in love at first sight with the same girl, unaware that she had been his victim. But then, learning that she is pregnant, he refuses to wed her. Finally, after much ado, all is resolved in Act 4, when he spies her souvenir, recognizes his property in fault, and says, "Hey, that's my ring. I love you. Let's get married." And thus the line of Athenian upper-class twits is perpetuated. So, so we're going to see this, especially in the history of the Romantic comedy is really tied into this idea of, and we're going to see this so blatantly smacked in the face in Midsummer Night's Dream, that comedy works as a kind of apology for rape. And so it's one of the dark undercurrents that underlines the logic of comedy. And if you think about it, just psychologically, like romantic comedies, to this day, there's the heroine initially is not into the hero, or vice versa, and then she's sort of overcome, and she realizes that she all along loved him, but she just didn't know it, right? And she's sort of overcome by masculine force, and so it's not like an actual rape, but it's a psychological analog of that. So you think of like Jane Austen, right? Pride and Prejudice. Are we familiar with Pride and Prejudice? I think everybody is. So she doesn't like Darcy, but Darcy turns out to be like way more potent than she imagined, and she realizes that she always already loved him. And he's just like, oh, and everything changed. So you see, like this is a really bad rape joke, right? So Fielding and Joseph Andrews has a character, and if I had a more vivid memory, I could exactly quote it, but it was one of the characters tries to rape her, but he couldn't because she consented at the last minute, this sort of thing. So it's a bad joke. It's funny how he said it. You have to trust me. But it's a dark thread that underlies comedy, because really in the original ones it really did work that way. And then of course in Midsummer Night's Dream there's but anywho, we'll get to that. But now we got to talk about comedy versus tragedy. So by the time of Aristophanes, the golden age of high tragedies that all the philosophers really liked is already over. Do we know any of the really classical like the super duper tragedies that everybody thinks is great. Comes up a lot. We don't have any classicists here. Can anyone think of an old Greek tragedy? All right, Oedipus.
Dante's
That's it's actually a comedy. It's the Divina Commedia. But so Oedipus, and do we remember what happens in Oedipus?
Well, through some circumstance, he's sent away from his family. He comes back years later, bumps into his father on the road, and challenges him for dominion.
Does he know it's his dad?
No.
No. Okay.
Kills him, marries his mother. They have children. He finds out that's his mom. He gouges his eyes out with a hot poker. Sadness ensues.
Yeah. And it's what makes it a tragedy is that he's fulfilling a preordained destiny. That the reason that he was separated from his family was because when he was born, a prophet soothsayer said, "This guy is going to kill you and sleep with your and have children with your wife to the king." And the king said, "Well, guess what? No, he's not." And so somebody, this is a recurrent motif in old stories. You got to leave the kid out to die of exposure, but gets adopted by the kind-hearted country folk. Who's always a little bit better than everyone, and he comes back and ends up fulfilling the prophecy. And so it's like no matter So the idea is, the deep, profound, tragic truth is what you do to avoid your tragic destiny is what fulfills it. And then the other great tragedy that there's a big raging argument of which is the best tragedy of all time. Is it Oedipus or is it Antigone? Anyone know Antigone? This is a little bit less.
Antigone is basically like the continuation of Oedipus because it's his children, and basically we don't see the one brother comes back to challenge the other brother, and they end up fighting and both killing each other. But that's all done like off before the play starts, and then it's Antigone wanting to bury her brother, but the new king keeps telling her she can't, and then she does it anyways, and he puts her in a cave to die.
And she hangs herself.
Yeah.
Because there was something more important in her life that she was willing to die for, and that was that her brother get a proper burial, in spite of the fact that by law he couldn't. So it was so again you have this tragic destiny because the law is the law, but the human situation, particularly the situation of the daughter, sister, it's sad or something. But the weird thing when you watch tragedies is that it's not very anxiety provoking, and they kind of make you feel better. We'll get into that. So this is what I was talking about. True tragedy requires some sort of necessity or determinism. The action follows the will of a god or fulfills a divine prophecy, but it's always inevitable. There's the tragic ending is what cannot be avoided. God does not play dice, to paraphrase Einstein, in the tragic universe. It's sad, but it's redemptive. The hero has it's meaningful. Gives his or her life for something more important than him or her, and that's probably why Antigone is probably the ultimate tragic hero, because Oedipus is Oedipus. Yes, sir.
So then what would you classify the movie as? Because it does follow kind of a sense of determinism. It's that tragic elements, the ending is technically what's happening.
Yeah. Well, and so the epic, came before. So tragedy and comedy are both spin-offs of the epic. Now the Aeneid came, obviously after this, and it was. But I would say that it if you're going to say it's a comedy or a tragedy, it follows more of a tragic. Like the outcome's good, but it follows the rules of tragedy. But it was, like you get epics only in very, very small historical windows where it seems like everything's coming together for, like manifest destiny moments, like where like the national moment is so powerful that it usurps the tragic machinery and makes the whole mechanism of tragedy come out with, me and my people on top. And so you only get the you get the great epics and Homer's Milton's Paradise Lost, right when England's about to take over the world. You'd think that there'd be some great American epic, but I don't think that there is. All right, and this is why tragedy makes us feel better, because it gives us a sense of order. We are willing to endure the unhappy ending for a world where there is a predictable cause and effect and a mechanism of justice, even if it happens to be unjust. So there's a great study that I think really demonstrates just the sort of brain chemistry, what's happening, why we tolerate tragedy. They did this big study with people who had colostomies. That's when you get your colon taken out. And some of them had where there was no chance that they would ever have it reversed, and there was some that had the possibility that someday they might have to get the plastic bag taken out and their colon put back in, and so they could poop naturally again. And then a year later, the people that had no hope were way better off. They were happier. They were better adjusted. They took the worst and they accepted it. But that lingering hope, that maybe, just releases the cortisol in your brain, which dissolves your hippocampus, and just these guys are just a wreck. They're either 20 pounds heavier or 20 pounds lighter, not adjusting well, alienated from family, getting divorces, and so it's better. The worst is better. That for sure it's the worst than wondering if it's the worst, even if it could only get better. So hope, too much hope for too long has the same effect as too much stress and despair in your brain, which is interesting. Would you have thought that?
Hope and stress can be the same thing.
Yeah, that hope and despair basically have the same effect on your brain long term.
Yeah. They use the same principle.
Yeah, I mean, when you start chewing on it, it's like, well, of course. Why would I think differently? But, and I think that I used to have a roommate that was going to AA meetings, and he would always talk to me about how the Lord works in mysterious ways, and he would always try to turn like really bad things. He had horrible luck, and he would just try to turn the everything bad into like a higher purpose. He took a lot of comfort in that, and I of course am like, and the higher purpose of this isn't going to. But so why isn't everything just? Why don't we just like tragedies? Why don't we just all want our colons removed right now so we don't have to live our lives and wondering, am I going to? If you think about it, you'll start freaking out. There's a possibility. I don't want a colostomy. But I'm thinking, we don't. There's a big hostility to determinism. Like we get mad about that, right? Do you like to think about like how all of your like they do the studies on twins, and you find out that things that you think are like your personal idiosyncrasy. So the twins are separated at birth or whatever, and then they meet up 30 years later, and they both are married to a woman with the same name, and they're both firefighters, and they both have the same cars with the same problems in the cars, and you're just like, whoa. So then and then you read like Richard Dawkins, The Selfish Gene, and Steven Pinker. Has anyone ever read Steven Pinker or Richard Dawkins? Well, they're big genetic determinists, and Steven Pinker in particular. And so, and he does a really good job of convincing you that every little thing you do is sort of genetically predetermined. Mm-hmm. Do we like that? No. But I mean, this would be comforting, right? So we all get the big thing. Well, that absolves us of responsibility, and there's no moral choice, and then we can't convict criminals, and he's not right? I mean, it's a fantasy. But yeah.
The biggest argument against Pinker, he said that language is an instinct. If language was an instinct, you wouldn't have different languages. We'd all have the same language. So that's his whole argument. So as far as the genetics determining everything, you can just kind of ignore him. I just wanted to say that.
Okay, yeah. There's a lot of anti-Pinkerness in the academy. And, he's a prick on top of everything else. But yeah, so we don't like that, right? And then there's other, like here's another one, like the idea that they'll be able to map your brain so closely that somebody can just literally watch your thoughts on a computer screen, or even better, like download it onto some software. Do we like this idea? No, because we want that little space. We want that little something, right? We want that little hole and that possibility that maybe this colostomy might go away after all. So it's kind of paradoxical. And people that like the Pinkers and not that advocate determinism, you always find out that it's their determinism that they're advocating. Like if they don't have like a part in formulating the theory. The only people that are determinists and there's like in physics, there's physics determinists too. And if they didn't come up with the theory, then they're always against it. So, we have comedy. Because comedy does not depend on determinism. It's the outcome of comedy is dependent on chance or an irrational miracle. It's never inevitable. There's no such thing as an inevitable comic ending. Nobody ever says that. And so we're going to be looking at some tendencies and stuff, and none of them are universal, and none of them are going to be universal in Shakespeare, because all Shakespeare does is play with conventions. But here are some conventions of comedy. All right, so we've talked about the tragic universe is deterministic. The comic universe is contingent. Do we know what contingent means? It's complicated. Yes, sir?
Essentially, like linear, one thing follows the next, cause and effect.
Actually not. That it's dependent on, it's not.
Oh,
That,
sorry, yeah.
So you can say, so it's most used in contemporary language because contingency, I think, actually is deeply frightening. So we say contingent upon, which is actually the opposite of contingent. So it's, contingent upon the weather, we will either hide under a rock or we'll have a picnic. But contingent really just means we're just throwing it up in the air. It's like a dice throw, except for it could be any outcome. So it's like an infinitely sided die. Ooh, that would be big. Do you know there's different sizes of infinity? Can you be mathematicians? Yeah.
Oh, you were asking for mathematicians. Yeah, so there's different sizes of infinity.
Magnitudes, right?
There's different magnitudes. A simple way to think of it is you have the real numbers. There's more real numbers than there are natural numbers. Natural numbers being integers. So, but there's also an infinite number of natural numbers.
Yeah. It still blows my mind. I just want one infinity. No, it's see, this is what's great about being in not just English major classes, is that you've got a mathematician in the back that can give you a good example of how there's different magnitudes of infinity. All right. So tragedy is plausible, meaningful. Comedy is stupid, irrational, and meaningless. And I mean that in the best way possible. Like trying to dig morals out of comedy, man. We're going to see it happen, and we're going to do it ourselves, but it's kind of stupid to put stupid in quotation marks. So, and tragedy, there's justice, and like we said, it's not always happy justice. It's but it's justice nonetheless. And comedy, we'll see, like people that you do not want, like in Measure for Measure, for instance, it's one of the things that has infuriated critics is that the guy gets completely let off, and this happens all the time in comedy, especially Shakespeare. Not like in Ben Jonson, a contemporary of Shakespeare, but this is the satire. This is what's different with comedy and satire. Is in satire, the bad guy gets his lunch fed to him, and there's not necessarily consequences in comedy. And then this is I forget who said it, but it was brilliant at the first of classes. Tragedies emphasize individuals and introspection, and comedy is just types and compulsive actions. It's just people do things, and if they think about it at all, we'll get some great Lysander ex post facto reasoning reason in quotes that but yeah. So tragedies, individual introspection, comedy, types, compulsive action. Oftentimes when I say things more than once in class, that's a good thing to write down because that sometimes winds up on tests. Studying though. Why do we like comedy? Well, we talked about how the well, why do we like comedy? Do you like comedy? No? Who said no? Yay! Why do you not like comedy? Because it's stupid, irrational, and meaningless?
Pretty much. I don't know. I'm very picky. There's a few out there that I'm like, oh, that was funny. But for the most part, I just...
Okay. So one answer is that we don't. You like comedy. Why do you like comedy?
Because of the exaggeration and the ridiculousness of the situation.
Yeah, but how about like brain chemicals?
It's just for us to grasp as a concept, because it's not like...
Because it's not even a concept.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Well, I think that there's woefully little research being conducted on like PET scans and jokes and comedy, and there's very little being done, and it needs to stop. They need to forget about all this everything else and just try and figure out what's going on in our brains when we're watching comedies, because I think it's really important. So we talked about like the colostomy example. Like it releases stress triggers in the brain, and it makes us anxious. But also trusting, and like I think when you're watching a comedy, you're going to kind of trust that everything's going to turn out okay. That's related to a pleasurable brain chemical called oxytocin, and it also releases opioids, which are the brain's natural sort of heroin. So and they'll find this in your lifetime. The comedy does this, and so you figure, because so just think of it kind of in an evolutionary context. Like why do all humans enjoy comedy except for you? I love it when I do things that all humans don't do. So like what's the I mean why would this give us an advantage over like let's say that Homo erectus was a lot like us but they had no comedies.
Well, comedy gives you a lot of just the breathing involved with laughing, there's a lot of endorphin release, a lot of stress management.
Yeah.
So if you were living out in the wild, say, being able to have a good laugh once in a while would keep you sort of rejuvenated and able to deal with the pressures of the world with.
Yeah. Yeah, and like to in spite of the discomfort that we feel when we find a hole in the deterministic universe, like the possibility that our colon's going to get replaced, that's a good thing, right? Because if we're just scared and we are just going to all sit in our caves and rip out our colons and deal with it, we're not gonna do well as a species. We've got to go out and do things that don't make sense. Like some jackass has to go and discover America, colonize the Americas. But but this is something our species has to do it. Otherwise, nothing happens. Studies show that between the number 1 and number 5 most attractive thing that a man can do to a woman is funny, right? And so, why would that be? I personally don't buy it because I think that women just laugh at people that they're attracted to. Right? Doesn't that just seem obvious? Because you always see some jackass standing there saying a lame joke and some girl like, But no, there's something about this, and I think it's that, there's something about the willingness to jump out of the deterministic universe and do something just stupid that has a potential payoff that it's good for people. It's part of being a person, is doing stupid stuff. So contingency is scary, but gambling's fun. I personally don't gamble, but people get off on this thing, and it's that same thing. So they have studied gamblers' brains, right? And yeah, you get this the brilliant neuroscientist Jacques Pansep has found, discovered, made up a specific pleasure center that's just about seeking novelty and just about throwing it out on the line and going out of your comfort zone. So it's scary, but it's good scary. It can be. So watching a comedy, unlike in tragedies, you're never, when you're watching a tragedy, nobody ever goes to Oedipus and's like, I hope it's going to turn out all right. You know, like, I mean, he's by the time that you're in it, he's already has kids with his mom. You know, that's not. This is only a really, really, really funny person can turn that into funniness, right? But in comedy, even when you know that it's going to turn out okay, still kind of wonder. You know, like, and it's anxious. Notice yourself when you're watching a comedy next time about how you feel most of the time, and that's why you're willing to put up with this crap. Because it doesn't feel good. You know, like my brother cannot watch comedies. He's just like, it's too stressful for him. He just has to leave. You know, he goes, tell me how it turns out. So the comic wager is pretty much just, if anything can happen, why not the best possible thing? So it's you know, like, you know, the ding dong guy that doesn't have any chance with, you know, like the beautiful girl at the knocked up. I haven't seen this, but I imagine this is the plot, right? And then, you know, like, something happens and it's just and then the release of anxiety. You know, like when you get the happy ending, you know, like you get the more traditional reward center. You know, our brains are trained to really like comic happy endings. Yeah, we're almost done, huh? So, the basic comic plot. Oh, we're not even going to get to it. Good gravy. All right. Basic comic plot. So, something happens in the law. There's a failure of the father figure or authority figure. In Dodgeball, you know, the father figure, authority figure, Ben Stiller decides that he wants to crush Average Joe's gym, but you know, he's a bully. He's in the inept father position that we'll find very often in comedies, or even a crisis of conscience. But anyway, like the status quo, something fractures the status quo, and you thought that you lived in a deterministic, tragic universe, but something happened that makes like, wait a second, there's a crack. So the comic hero goes to the green world that we were talking about to work through the comic consequences. Now in Athens, by the way, you really could leave the city, and it was sort of a kind of anything goes. You really could do that. Some sort of miracle intervenes, making the impossibility of a happy ending happen, and it's so we've got the contingency scene. So the first part establishes that contingency is possible, and then the miracle uses the fact that anything's possible to make whatever you want to happen possible. And then in the end, you know, like in the classic comedy, you go back to the world of law, and usually you get married, and you make up with dad, or you supplant him, or you know, whatever, you know, or Ben Stiller gets really sad and just keeps eating and turns into a big fat guy. That's it. But we're not done. I still have all of this to go through. I guess we're going to have to do this. We're going to have to do this manana. A couple of more things that... all right. We'll talk more about this, but I want you to chew on this a little bit. And that it mimics the feeling of falling in love, right? So what happens is you're walking down the street, you think everything's cool, and then this guy just comes around the corner, and you talk to him, and you're just like that. And then you talk to him, and you're just like, whoa. And what happens is and this is again, neuroscience shows us that when you're in love, the reasoning center of your brain starts shutting down. So don't fall in love before finals. And the chemicals being released in your brain are very much like an amphetamine high. All right, and this lasts between 6 months and 2 years. So like it's literally, like a drug. So you go into the green world where reason and law don't make sense, and you're like, but you can't do this, right? You're a slobbering idiot going around, but you've got finals to take. So what comedy wants to do is it's engendering this, but it also wants to kill it. How do we kill love? Marriage. So you've got this fuzzy zone, you're misbehaving, everything's going awry, and then the only thing that you can do is you've got to get it back into law, into this ceremony, so you can kill the fuzziness of the love and make it just part of the law. So you don't have to be in love because this bitch has to stay with you because it's the law and she's married to you. And that's comedy. Okay, I'll see you Wednesday.